Hello, and welcome to another installment of the Lawn Chair Philosophy Foundation Scholar Spotlight Series. I am thrilled and excited to welcome Professor Saulius Geniusas to the stage to present the Phenomenology of Daydreaming. Thank you so much, Saul. Welcome here.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's a pleasure to see the faces of people I haven't seen in so many years. Really a true pleasure. What I want to do today then is take this opportunity to share some thoughts with you on issues in phenomenology that I've been working on over the last few years. I'm interested in you could say, displaced experiences, phenomenology of displaced experiences. These kinds of experiences that we live through when we dream or daydream, when we fall into a certain kind of absorbed memories, when we fall into certain kind of absorbed fantasies. So I'm interested in this possibility that not all experiences unfold from the here and now, that in some ways we have the freedom to escape the here and now. And it is from within this standpoint then that something like daydreaming has become of interest to me. So what I want to do is share with you the paper itself that I'm going to present. I believe it will be easier for you to follow me if you have the text in front of you. And of course, if it so happens that you do not want to see the text in front of you, you don't have to look at it. Okay, so let me then begin. So this paper that I'm about to present to you, and it will take me about, just a word of warning, close to 40 minutes, I believe. So this paper is on a highly unusual theme, daydreaming. And it might seem to you from the start that we face here a highly irrelevant theme. So let me try then to convince you from the very start that such is not the case. So consider the following. Psychologists and cognitive scientists now claim that a group of experiences, which they call spontaneous thoughts, make up from 1/3 to 1/2 of our conscious thoughts. Now, daydreaming, along with mind wandering, belongs to this group of experiences. Now, suppose you are doing phenomenology. Suppose you understand phenomenology as a philosophical science of consciousness. So here is a question then. How can you understand consciousness if you ignore what it does for 1/3 or even 1/2 of its wakeful life? Clearly, for as long as you remain ignorant of what happens during such a long period of conscious life, your understanding of consciousness will be severely limited. Thus, if you really want to understand consciousness, you cannot ignore such phenomena as daydreaming. So this apparently trivial and irrelevant phenomenon is not so trivial or irrelevant after all. But what is daydreaming? And where are we to look for an answer? In general, when it comes to spontaneous thoughts, the dominant approach suggests that we focus on the content of experience. So thus, according to the most popular definition, spontaneous thoughts are, as one puts it in psychology, task-independent and stimulus-unrelated thoughts. Now, there are two problems with this view. First, it doesn't allow us to distinguish daydreaming from other spontaneous thoughts, such as mind wandering. And second, especially from the phenomenological standpoint, such approaches are one-sided since they focus exclusively on the content side and they ignore the other side that it is correlated with, namely modes of experiencing. So let me then begin with the first problem first. How are we to distinguish daydreaming from mind wandering? We need to turn to a phonological description. Mind wandering, as the term suggests, lacks focus. I think for a second of my holiday in Europe, then my mind turns to a philosophical paper I'm working on. Then I ask myself, what will I prepare for dinner? then a conversation with a good friend, then I ask myself how many days are left until I will be home, and so on and so forth. So what you have here then are underdeveloped stories. Or another way to put it, what you have here is a collection of photographs that are unrelated to each other. Daydreaming is different. When you daydream, you spin a tale. There is the beginning, there is the development, and not always, on occasion, there is even the end. I daydream say that I am visiting an old friend and we are engaged in a conversation. He asks me how I have been, and I start answering the question, focusing on these rather than other details. I see in my daydream his reaction as I play out this imaginary answer. He offers me a coffee, and we move to his kitchen to make it. I comment on his espresso machine, and so on and so forth. So here we no longer have an underdeveloped story or a series of underdeveloped stories. Rather, there is the story under development. We don't have unrelated pictures, but a movie of sorts. But as I have already mentioned, content doesn't suffice. One also needs to take into account the mode of experience. In this regard, daydreaming belongs to the group of those experiences that are to be qualified as displaced experiences. And that's something I was already alluding you to at the very beginning. When we daydream, we live through the content of our experience, not from the here and now standpoint, but from a displaced there and then standpoint. So to return to my example, when I daydream that I'm visiting an old friend, I experience the imaginary events as if I were there and not here where I am. Now, one more last introductory note before I turn into the details. What are we to expect from a phenomenology of daydreaming? Clearly, phenomenology is not a matter of sharing peculiar stories about certain daydreams. Phenomenology is concerned with the structure of consciousness or structure of experiences. So the guiding questions here are as follows. What must conscious life be if it is to be capable of daydreaming? How does daydreaming relate to other modes of experience? What are the eidetic features and constitutive functions of daydreaming in the overall life of consciousness? So these questions then clarify what is unique to a phenomenological analysis of daydreaming. They also clarify what I will be concerned with in this lecture. Since the answers to these questions are nowhere to be found, one can claim that phenomenology can and should make an important contribution to philosophy of daydreaming and, more generally, to cross-disciplinary research on spontaneous thoughts. Okay, so these were introductory remarks. Now, let's turn to this fundamental question: what is daydreaming? Now, as you know, in phenomenology, it's important to begin with an example. Begins with examples, and one reflects on them, and one extracts certain features from them. So imagine you're riding a car on a long road trip, and that you start daydreaming. Your mind is absorbed in thoughts, yet you don't cause an accident. You slow down and speed up, you pass other cars, or let them pass you. You change the radio station, take the exit when you need to. While daydreaming, the imaginary scene absorbs your attention, yet you remain peripherally conscious of your surroundings. You do not abandon reality. You keep it at a distance. As Merleau-Ponty has it, the world remains in the divergence. So, what does this example tell us? It shows us what is already entailed in the English term daydream, or the German term Tagtraum for that matter. In fact, let me mention in passing that in many other languages, there is no such term as daydreaming, and that introduces some complications. One employs terms that are not related to dreams in any sense of the term to qualify what in German or English one calls a daydream. But despite this complication, let me say that daydreaming is a paradoxical phenomenon, not just a term, but a phenomenon. both a mode of wakefulness and a mode of sleep. It belongs to the light of day and to the world of dreams. Like other wakeful experiences, and in contrast to non-lucid night dreaming, so by non-lucid night dreaming, I mean those night dreams in the case of which, when we night dream, we are not aware that we are night dreaming. That's the distinction I'm alluding to. So like other wakeful experiences, and in contrast to non-lucid night dreaming, daydreaming takes place in the presence of the world. Again, to refer to Merleau-Ponty, it does not fully abandon itself to the abundance of the imagined. Yet this presence also entails a curious absence. So I'm present to the world, but at the same time, I'm absent from it. Daydream lies between wakefulness and sleep. It has one foot in the actual world, another foot in the dream world. Now, daydreaming is a kind of dream, which means there must be some features that daydreaming and night dreaming share. Right? So what are those features? First, both constitute their own worlds, within which all the dreamt scenes are played out. That is, both present us with coherent stories. Second, both rely on a narrative structure. While daydreaming or night dreaming, we spin a tale in which we ourselves are involved, sometimes as observers, other times as protagonists. Third, these tales can be considered as expressions of affective rather than conceptual thinking. Fourth, for the most part, we don't spin these tales in words, but in images. So while daydreaming or night dreaming, these scenes for the most part unfold as chains of visualizing thoughts. And let me allude you here to a highly interesting writer whom I would guess you haven't heard of, Julien Warendonck. Julien Warendonck wrote a trailblazing study, Psychology of Daydreams. He wrote it in English, in fact, in 1921, so more than 100 years ago. And it was the first study of daydreaming in psychology. Warendonck wrote this work in the front during the First World War. He had lost his dissertation at the front some years earlier, and he had to start again from scratch. And he changed his dissertation topic and decided to write a pioneering work on the psychology of daydreaming. He said to himself, Freud had written on night dreams, but nobody had written on daydreams. So let me write this first book. He published this work in English. He was, in fact, working as an interpreter for the British Army at the war, during the war. And the introduction to the work was written then by Sigmund Freud. So as Warendonck then remarks in this study, the psychology of daydreams, he says, we are able to think in words, but lower in the animal scale, where speech is absent, what else but images can exist as elements of thoughts? As mentioned before, the conceptual distinction between daydreams and mind wandering can never be fixed. It has never been fixed. It can be fixed. It has never been fixed. We can distinguish between them along the following lines. Daydreaming forms a specific world. It shapes a particular series of events. It creates a story with its own scenario. By contrast, mind wandering is impatient, underdeveloped, chaotic. It is less like a video and more like a photo. Or alternatively, if daydreaming is like a movie, then mind wandering is like a series of unrelated movie trailers that randomly follow each other. Mind wandering offers us an image or a set of moving images, yet it doesn't develop them into a full-fledged scenario. Development is prevented, aborted, interrupted. Consciousness abandons the phantasmatic image and moves on to other images. Okay, so at this point, then we can say that when we daydream, we simultaneously inhabit two separate worlds, the actual world and the dream world. This distinguishes daydreaming from non-lucid night dreaming, which is characterized by full absorption in the imaginary dream world. It also distinguishes daydreaming from mind wandering, which is worldless. It doesn't form a world. In this regard, daydreaming is like lucid night dreaming. So lucid night dreaming is that kind of dreaming during which we dream and we are aware of the fact that we are dreaming. When we dream lucidly, we are immersed in the dream, yet we simultaneously know that we are dreaming. So where then lies the difference between lucid night dreaming and daydreaming? Daydreaming does not rob us of the possibility of acting in the world. So remember, you being in the car, absorbed in your daydreams. You are acting at the same time, right? When we daydream, we can still drive the car or brush the teeth or even listen to a talk on daydreaming. By contrast, lucid night dreaming takes place when we are only passively related to the world. We are aware of the actual world since we are aware that we are dreaming, but our bodies remain motionless and we are not involved in any activities. While lucid night dreaming is a sleeping state, daydreaming is a wakeful state. During night dreaming, lucid night dreaming, consciousness is awake while dreaming. During daydreaming, consciousness is dreaming while awake. We can qualify then lucid night dreaming as wakeful sleep and daydreaming as sleeping wakefulness. A subtle difference, but a difference nonetheless. It is still not clear how we are to distinguish daydreaming and fantasy. And here I would like to draw some references to a quite remarkable and often overlooked study by Theodor Conrad. So in this remarkable study, which is called Zur Wesenslehre des psychischen Lebens und Erlebens, Conrad maintained that not all experiences are lived from the standpoint of the here and now. There is a whole group of experiences which Conrad qualifies as displaced experiences. And this allows us then to distinguish between daydreaming and fantasy according to the following lines. Daydreaming is a mode of experience that engages in its own fantasies from a displaced standpoint. By contrast, fantasy is a mode of consciousness that engages in its own formation from the here and now. Otherwise put, daydreaming consciousness is fantasy consciousness that is absorbed in fantasies. Okay, let's move down to the analysis of the specific self-awareness that characterizes daydreaming. We already know that daydreaming is a matter of inhabiting two worlds simultaneously, the actual and the dream world. So our next task then is to understand how this is possible. And with this in mind, let me draw some references to Husserl's classical analysis of attention in Ideas 1. Here, as well as in some other texts, Husserl draws a distinction between three modes of attention: attentional focus, co-attention, and inattention. Now that I think about it, I seem to recall that you, Eric, were interested in attention some, my goodness, 12, 13 years ago. These distinctions are of great importance in the present context between these three modes of attention. While daydreaming is attentionally focused on the dream world, it is also simultaneously either co-attentive or inattentive to the actual world. This co-attentiveness or this inattentiveness, and I will clarify the difference between them shortly. So this co-attentiveness or inattentiveness, they are not just accidental, but essential features of daydreaming. Precisely because of them, daydreaming consciousness remains bound to the actual world. Now, in contemporary literature on spontaneous thoughts, and especially in psychology, it is common to draw a distinction between tuning out and zoning out as two fundamental modes of daydreaming and mind-wandering. Zachary Irving and Aaron Thompson, who are those rare philosophers to engage in such themes as daydreaming and mind-wandering in their works, so they suggest that tuning out qualifies aware mind-wandering, while zoning out refers to unaware mind-wandering. In this regard, Irving and Thompson follow the classical analysis of tuning out and zoning out as developed in psychology. So we come across this distinction in an important, influential, certainly, study by Smallwood and his colleagues. Tuning out, your mind wanders, and you know it all along. Zoning out, your mind wanders, but you don't realize this until you catch it. But for the moment, let's disregard the distinction between mind wandering and daydream. Using Husserlian terminology, we can translate the psychological distinction into a phenomenological one. Tuning out is a matter of co-attention. Zoning out is a matter of inattention. The modes of awareness of which we here speak, so co-attention and inattention, are also at the same time modes of self-awareness. So while engaged in daydreaming, one is co-attentive to one's surroundings, one is also at the same time co-attentive to the fact that one is daydreaming. By contrast, while daydreaming, one is inattentive to one's surroundings, one is also inattentive to the fact that one is daydreaming. In short, in the case of daydreaming, self-awareness and world awareness go hand in hand. So such a phenomenological reinterpretation of tuning out and zoning out brings into question the common assumption that only tuning out and not zoning out is characterized by the self-awareness and world awareness. Now, this is the view commonly held in psychology. Presumably, zoning out is a matter of losing consciousness of the world. Presumably, it is a matter of losing self-consciousness. But in this regard, one must stress that inattention is a mode of attention. Instead of drawing a crude distinction between aware daydreaming and unaware daydreaming, it is phenomenologically more appropriate to rely on a more subtle distinction between explicit and implicit, or patent and latent, self-awareness that accompanies daydreaming. This is a subtle but important distinction. While tuning out is characterized by explicit or patent self-awareness, zoning out is qualified by implicit or latent self-awareness. So imagine it's late Saturday night and you are lying in bed with a book in your hands. Instead of reading it, you start daydreaming. As you drift into your daydream, your partner lying next to you asks you a question. If you are attentive to the surrounding world, then you can hear the question and answer it. If you are inattentive to the surrounding world, then you still hear the question and you still respond, although only by asking your partner to repeat the question. By contrast, if you already fall asleep, then you do not respond. In the case of night dreaming, then, it would be inaccurate to claim that you are inattentive to what is taking place around you. To be inattentive to X, Y, or Z, you must still experience X, Y, or Z. Yet the events that take place in the surroundings, for the most part, lie beyond the experience of sleeping consciousness. In those rare instances when sleeping consciousness experiences the events taking place in the surroundings, it either wakes up or reinterprets them and absorbs them into the dream world. Now, I see here that someone cannot hear me, but Kelly is responding to that. Okay, so this is a technical issue that I'll let you, Kelly, deal with. I'll continue then. The distinction between implicit or latent and explicit or patent self-awareness is important, for it allows us not to conflate daydreaming with lucid and non-lucid night dreaming. Non-lucid night dreaming lacks self-awareness. Lucid night dreaming is characterized only by latent self-awareness. By contrast to both, as we just saw, daydreaming can be either patently or latently self-aware. At this point, we can say that all daydreaming is self-aware, although not in one and the same sense of the term. While in some cases, when we daydream, we are patently aware that we are daydreaming. In other cases, we are only latently aware that we are daydreaming. That is, in some cases, while daydreaming, we are co-attentive to the surrounding world and to ourselves. In other cases, we are inattentive to both. Besides being aware that one is daydreaming, one can also be aware of oneself in the daydream. This is another feature that distinguishes daydreaming from wakeful perceptions on the one hand and non-lucid dreams on the other hand. When we perceive things around us, we are at least latently aware that we are perceiving them. Yet it would be absurd to speak of being aware of ourselves in our perceptions. By contrast, when it comes to non-lucid night dreaming, we are aware of ourselves in the dream, although not aware that we are dreaming. So suppose you are night dreaming that you are being chased by a serial killer. For as long as you have not woken up from this nightmare, you do not know that you are lying comfortably in your own bed. Your consciousness is absorbed in the belief that you are there in the dark streets and alleys running for your life. In contrast to both, when we daydream, we are aware of ourselves in both senses of the term. We are aware, at least implicitly, that we are daydreaming and aware of ourselves in the daydream. This doesn't yet allow us to grasp the unique structure of self-awareness that characterizes daydreaming. This is because memory, anticipation, and fantasy are also characterized by such a twofold structure of self-awareness. So recollective consciousness is aware that it is remembering and aware of itself in the recollection. Thus, if I have an intuitive recollection of teaching Kelly at JMU, I see myself in Cleveland Hall, while at the same time, I'm aware that I'm having this recollection. Right? So also with anticipation. Anticipatory consciousness is aware that it is anticipating and aware of itself in the anticipation. Thus, if I have an intuitive anticipation of seeing some of you in the near future, I see the smile on your face as you greet me, while at the same time I'm aware that I'm living through this anticipation here and now. So also with fantasy, one is aware that one is fantasizing and aware of oneself in the fantasy. Thus, if I fantasize that I'm taking a walk by the sea, then I see myself walking, while at the same time I'm aware that I'm having this fantasy. Is there anything specific then about the self-awareness that characterizes daydreaming? And recall here Theodore Conrad's important insight. Daydreaming is an experience of displacement. When one daydreams, one is displaced from the here and now to the there and then. Nonetheless, in contrast to non-lucid night dreaming, daydreaming consciousness remains aware of the here and now, although not in the primary sense of the term. The awareness of the here and now is only marginal, background awareness. Daydreaming consciousness first and foremost lives in the daydream, while it still remains anchored in the actual world. The self-awareness that characterizes daydreaming is less intense, more marginal than the self-awareness that accompanies recollection, anticipation, and fantasy. Here we can draw then a distinction between a broad and a narrow sense of daydream. In the broad sense, all wakeful experiences of displacement, insofar as they open up a world, can be characterized as modes of daydreaming, irrespective of whether one is displaced into the past, the future, or the phantasmatic realm. In the narrow sense, one can further distinguish daydreaming from absorbed memories and absorbed anticipations. In such a narrow sense, daydreaming is an experience of displacement that transposes consciousness from the here and now to the purely phantasmatic field, which is not only cut off from the present, but also from the past and future. Yet, as mentioned above, daydreaming consciousness cannot liberate itself from the here and now. Throughout all wakeful displacement, consciousness remains marginally bound to the here and now. Thus, the self-awareness that characterizes daydreaming entails a number of distinguishing features. First, it is to be understood in a twofold sense, both as the awareness that one is daydreaming and the awareness of oneself in the daydream. Second, the awareness that one is daydreaming is only marginal. It occurs in the background of consciousness, and it can be either patent, here referred to co-attentiveness, or latent, inattentiveness. Third, daydreaming consciousness is not just aware of itself in the daydream. It is in fact absorbed in the daydream, and this means daydreaming consciousness is aware of itself in the daydream as the displaced 0 point of orientation and as a displaced agent of action from which all the displaced perceptions and displaced activities unfold. And fourth, depending on how broadly or narrowly one understands daydreaming, the self-awareness of oneself in the daydream is an experience of displacement either only in the phantasmatic field or also in the absorbed past and absorbed future. Okay, so at this point, I believe we understand the structure of daydreaming much more precisely than we did before I started this lecture. Now I want to turn to another important theme in phenomenology, which is usually referred to as Ich-Spaltung, or the splitting of the ego. Daydreaming belongs to the group of those experiences which cannot be qualified either as purely active or purely passive. When I daydream, thoughts themselves come, and I abandon myself to them. In this regard, daydreaming is passive. But nobody else puts these thoughts into our minds. Consciousness itself passively entertains those thoughts that it generates. Thus, daydreaming is also active. Here we can recall the peculiar structure of experience, which in Husserlian phenomenology is usually addressed under the heading of the splitting of the ego, Ich-Spaltung. In classical Husserlian phenomenology, this structure was primarily reserved for fantasy consciousness, although it also fits recollective and anticipatory consciousness. According to Husserl, there is no fantasy experience without the splitting of the ego into the fantasizing and the fantasized ego. Suppose I'm fantasizing that I'm driving in a tuk-tuk from one temple to another in Angkor Wat. There is the ego sitting in the office, engaged in this fantasy, and there is that other ego, that is the projected ego that is in the tuk-tuk in Angkor Wat. All our fantasies rely on such a split. In the present context, we can ask if this structure of experience also qualifies daydreaming. Now, the answer to this question is in fact quite complicated. And so there are a number of steps now that I want to take while turning to different thinkers and to answer this question in such a dialogical fashion. So consider first how Theodor Conrad addresses this question. He understands daydreaming as a modality of displaced experience. This we already know. He speaks of a real or actual daydreaming and contends that, in contrast to wakeful fantasy, daydreaming is not characterized by the splitting of the ego. In the case of pure daydreaming, only one side of the egoic bifurcation sees the light of day. One is absorbed in one's fantasies. Still, Conrad further emphasizes that daydreaming is not a complete absorption, and in this regard, it differs from absolute immersion in the dream. Now, this view strikes me as incoherent. If daydreaming is not characterized by the splitting of the ego, then daydreaming must be an instance of a complete absorption and complete displacement. Between the splitting of the ego and complete absorption, one must choose. One cannot have it both ways. If there is no splitting of the ego in daydreaming, that is, if the daydreaming ego fully identifies him or herself with the daydreamt ego, then the ego is fully absorbed in its own daydream. But in such a case, there is no longer any distinction to be drawn between daydreaming and non-lucid night dream. But as we saw, Conrad is unwilling to accept such an implication. So hence, incoherence. In this regard, Gaston Bachelard's account of daydreaming in his also quite fascinating work, Poetics of Reverie, is highly relevant. Bachelard qualifies the splitting of the ego as the ontological paradox of reverie. He says, by transporting the dreamer into another world, reverie makes the dreamer into a person different from himself. Yet Bachelard continues, he says, this other person is still himself, the double of himself. Bachelard further compares this form of splitting with that of which the psychiatrists speak when they address split personalities, and he contends that, as he puts it, reverie, and not night dreaming, retains mastery over its splittings. As he further notes, in reality, reverie splits the being more gently, more naturally, and with what variety. This is what allows us then to distinguish between daydreaming and non-lucid night dreaming. As Bachelard has it, I quote him again, and here's the radical difference for us between the nocturnal dream and reverie, the radical difference, a difference deriving from phenomenology. While the dreamer of the nocturnal dream is a shadow who has lost his self, the dreamer of reverie is he if he is a bit philosophical, can formulate a cogito at the center of his dreaming self. So I would like them to accept Bashlar's remarks as a confirmation that not only conscious fantasy, but daydreaming too is qualified by the splitting of the ego. So again, what does the splitting of the ego mean in the case of daydreaming? Well, when I daydream that I am, engaged in a conversation with you in Cleveland Hall, then I'm aware of myself in Cleveland Hall as well as aware of myself sitting here and now in a different continent. So that's the splitting of the ego in the case of daydreaming. But this distinction is still half finished. And here I would like to draw some references to James Morley, who is the only contemporary phenomenologist I know of to have been focused on daydreaming in his research for more than 2 decades. Morley contends that daydreaming entails not 2, but 3 egological positions, which are occupied by what he calls the habitual subject, the enacting subject, and the directing spectator. The presence of the habitual subject explains how a person can continue to respond competently to the environment while preoccupied with daydream. Thus, while riding the car on a long and monotonous road trip, I may start daydreaming, yet even if I do, I won't lose control of the car. This means that when I daydream, I continue to be aware of myself as a habitual subject. The concept of the enacting subject refers to the presence of the daydreamed ego in the daydreaming experience. So in the words of one of Morley's interviewees, I was completely the actor. According to Morley, the structure of daydreaming also entails the presence of the third ego, the directing spectator. And this is what you find missing in other literature, this concept of the directing spectator. This concept refers to the subject who acts as a director or playwright, the one who writes the daydreaming scenario. One of Morley's interviewees describes this role as playing God. Another interviewee describes it as a matter of playing with puppets, where you are pulling all the strings. What is at stake here is the plain recognition on the part of daydreaming subjects that they were in control of the daydreaming experience. This explicit recognition that daydreaming experience entails the awareness of oneself as a directing spectator is of great importance for phenomenology of daydream. It allows one to explain why, as Freud had already argued, adults are ashamed of their daydreams and are generally unwilling to reveal them to others. Note that when it comes to night dreams, the situation is significantly different. Adults often have no problems speaking about them in an open way. So how are we to understand this difference? It concerns the fact that daydreaming is accompanied by the awareness of oneself as the directing spectator, while night dreaming lacks such self-awareness. Insofar as I am aware of myself as the directing spectator of my daydreams, I am unwilling to reveal their content to anyone, for if I did, it would become clear that, as Freud insists, the strange content of my daydreams expresses my suppressed erotic wishes, ambitions, and fears. It thereby becomes understandable why, as Freud puts it, we would rather confess our misdeeds than tell anyone our fantasies. Similarly, this explicit recognition that daydreaming experience entails the awareness of oneself as a directing spectator also enables us to understand the distinction between daydreaming and night dreaming that we come across in Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Reverie. Bachelard writes, "The night dream is a dream without a dreamer. On the contrary, the dreamer of reverie remains conscious enough to say, 'It is I who dreams the reverie. It is I who am content to dream my reverie, happy with its leisure in which I no longer have the task of thinking.' The dreamer of reverie remains self-aware as the directing spectator, and this is why he or she can proclaim, 'I am the one who dreams this daydream.'" So at this point, then, we can say that daydreaming is self-aware in 3 fundamental senses of the term. So first, while daydreaming, the conscious subject is aware of itself as the habitual subject, that is, as the actual daydreaming ego. And as we saw, this self-awareness can be both patent and latent. Second, the daydreaming subject is also self-aware as the enacting subject, or as the daydreamt ego, the one that finds him or herself in the daydream. And last but not least, the daydreaming subject is also self-aware as a directing spectator who writes the script in accordance with which all activities unfold. Now, at this point, I have a question for you, Kelly. I mentioned that my talk would be around 40 minutes long. It's already about 40 minutes long. There is still one section and a short conclusion. So I can go in both ways. I can either turn to the conclusion and then finish in a few minutes, and we can turn to the Q&A session. Or I can still turn to one additional section. This is up to you.
Keep going. I want to hear the whole thing.
Okay. It's not my fault, everyone. Please blame Kelly for this. So the constitutive function of daydream. This will be then the next theme. It's a shorter section. It won't be so painful, I hope. So there is an important objection to consider, and this objection runs as follows. It would be a crude misunderstanding to think that phenomenology's goal is to describe various peculiarities of consciousness. Rather, phenomenology was always concerned with the clarification of the eidetic features of conscious life as well as of its constitutive functions. Yet even though the foregoing discussion has shown that daydreaming has distinctive eidetic features, this does not yet allow us to claim that it also has important constitutive functions. Much like fantasy or sleep, it appears to give consciousness a chance to take a break from what phenomenologists such as Husserl have called world constitution. We thus have to go back to the question with which we started. Why should daydreaming be of interest to phenomenologists? Imagine the impossible, a person incapable of daydreaming. Such a person's wakeful life would be fully confined to the actual. She would perceive things around her, she would remember the past, anticipate the future, yet her capacity to imagine things different from how they are would be severely constrained. Being bound to the actual, she would not be able to consider alternative scenarios. Such a person would in effect be similar to the one that Borges describes in his Funes, his memory. No single detail happening around such a person would escape attention, yet, as Borges notes, he says, I suspect nevertheless that he was not very good at thinking. To think is to ignore or forget differences, to generalize, to abstract. Daydreaming provides consciousness with rudimentary distance that one needs in order to think. So this is then a working hypothesis, if you will, that I wish to put forth. Why do I say so? Or what could possibly justify this claim, which appears at first glance to be quite counterintuitive? In contemporary psychology and cognitive sciences, daydreaming is understood as a member of a broader family of mental phenomena that are usually labeled as spontaneous thoughts. In the literature, we come across a suggestion that such modes of experience as daydreaming and mind-wandering are the default strategies of consciousness. When not engaged in any specific task-oriented thinking, our minds will be mind-wandering or daydream. So take away tasks from us, and our mind will fall into daydream. With these discussions in mind, one can entertain a working hypothesis that, as Borges notes, thinking is a matter of ignoring differences, of generalizing, of abstracting, because in its most basic form, thinking is daydream. To put it phenomenologically, daydreaming then is cogito at birth, a nascent cogito, or as some psychologists contend, daydreaming is the default state. All other modes of the cogito are in this regard forms of daydreaming held in check and subjected to our control. This suggests that a person incapable of daydreaming is also incapable of thinking. Daydreaming is unrestrained cogito. It is an embryonic form of the cogito that entertains ideas in the form of sensory images and that is not yet guided by this or that goal. So also a form of the cogito that is not yet bound by this or that rule. In short, a wild cogito, a cogito untamed, an inchoate form of the cogito that is free both thematically and methodologically. Precisely because it is free, consciousness can also design the method it wishes to follow and the goals it wishes to achieve. We can identify daydreaming as a nascent cogito, which underlies all methodologically guided, task-oriented thinking. Now, if this is accepted, if this is correct, then one can claim that the constitutive function of daydreaming is fundamental, and it is to be clarified genetically, that is, by recognizing that daydreaming is a default mode of the cogito, that it lies at the origins of thinking, and that it therefore makes highly diverse constitutive achievements possible. But here we are on the brink of a misunderstanding, and so as to avoid it, let me stress that daydreaming is a default mode of thinking, not a default mode of experience. Daydreaming is only conceivable as a modification. It modifies the way things appear, the way scenarios unfold, or the way we act in the world. Something must already be given in experience if daydreaming is to be possible. Yet to claim that daydreaming is a modification of experience is by no means to denigrate its significance. As a modification, daydreaming is a manifestation of spontaneity and freedom. Consciousness itself generates the sensory images, which it then passively relates to. This spontaneity and this freedom lie at the bottom of all cogito. I called daydreaming an unrestrained form of the cogito. And this makes it understandable why in Freud's classical studies, daydreaming was considered to be a nascent form of various pathologies. Daydreaming becomes pathological when daydreaming consciousness loses the awareness that it is daydreaming. Daydreaming is Janus-faced. As cogito untamed, daydreaming is the source of diverse forms of thinking and of diverse pathologies. So let me conclude with a few observations, and then we can turn to your questions and your comments. I started out with a suggestion that our understanding of the life of consciousness will remain severely limited for as long as we ignore daydreaming. In what ways, then, does phenomenology of daydreaming enrich our understanding of the life of consciousness? So let me conclude by offering 3 answers to this question. First, the phenomenology of daydreaming here offered forces us to abandon the dichotomous view that sets wakefulness and sleep in sharp opposition to each other. Just as there is wakefulness in sleep, so also there is sleep in wakefulness. The life of consciousness is characterized by the intertwining of sleep and wakefulness. Such intertwining does not refer to anything exceptional or unusual, but qualifies ordinary experiences. So that's the first point. Now, second, we can take this to mean that the life of consciousness is not confined to the here and now. Besides those experiences which unfold from the present standpoint, there is also another group of experiences which we can qualify as absorbed or displaced experiences. Daydreaming makes clear that such experiences of displacement are not pathological exceptions, but regular occurrences. Third, phenomenological analysis of daydreaming brings to light that different modes of experience are characterized by different modes of self-awareness. That's something that I'm much focused on in this lecture. We have grown accustomed to addressing self-awareness as a monolithic feature of conscious life, as a general structure without which no experience would be possible. I do not want to denigrate the importance of these analyses, but at the same time, I wish to stress that self-awareness can be spoken of in many ways, and that to a large extent, different modes of experience are marked by different types of self-awareness. Phenomenologists, among other philosophers and psychologists, have been successful in showing that all experiences are pre-reflectively and pre-objectively self-aware. We can nonetheless state that the life of consciousness cannot be understood in sufficient detail if our accounts are focused only on general features of conscious life. Something is missing, namely a clear recognition that the different modes of experience are marked by different modes of self-awareness. Consciousness relates to itself pre-reflectively in a plethora of ways. The 3 moments I have singled out under the heading of the habitual subject, the enacting subject, and the directing subject intertwine in a unique way in daydreaming experience. So thank you for your attention. This is what I wanted to share with you about daydreaming.
Thank you so much. Yay. Open up the floor because I have a bad habit of just jumping in and steamrolling everybody. So I'm going to let others have a chance to speak and ask questions first.
Could I ask a question then? So it really reminded me of like the pre-predicative judgments in Erfahrung and Urteil, but I feel like it doesn't have like the Stiftung element to it. So like how you get to the tupus, and like I feel like when you are divided like the directed subject, the habitual subject, and the enacting subject, I feel like if we were thinking in the life world, you would just say we gain these tupus that are just like we do passively in a sense. And so I was wondering, like, are you trying to develop more of like a static phenomenological analyst by not involving the life world? Or like, what's your stance on like Erfahrung and Urteil within your daydreaming analysis?
Very good question. Thank you for raising this question. So I would say that, I mentioned at the start that phenomenology of daydreaming is concerned with different tasks. One of the tasks is that of clarifying the eidetic features of daydreaming experience. Phenomenology must do that. And besides that, it must also clarify what one could call the constitutive function of daydreaming, or one could also call it the genetic function of daydreaming. So I would say that one of those functions falls under the heading of static phenomenology, while the other function falls under the heading of genetic phenomenology. And it's very interesting that you refer here to Erfahrung und Urteil, to experience and judgment, because one can say that the way I tried to answer the second question, namely the way I tried to articulate the genetic function of daydreaming, places this whole story within the framework of experience and judgment as an additional chapter. So I claim, for instance, quite explicitly that daydreaming is an original mode of the cogito, but not an original mode of experience. Right? That must be understood as a modification of experience. Right? And that, of course, already places the whole problematic within the general structure that guides Husserl's analysis in experience and judgment. So it's a very perceptive question that you ask. It's a question that closely relates to the manner in which I'm thinking here of daydreaming.
We have a question in the chat here, the Q&A. An anonymous attendee. I would like to know your thoughts and opinions about daydreaming for those who have depression or may have been through a trauma. Has there been any research into these situations or mental health conditions and their capacity to daydream? If they daydream more frequently, and if daydreaming assists in cognitive processing of trauma?
Yeah. Also, a very good question that I did not touch upon, because it's a question that is addressed in much greater detail by psychologists than by philosophers. Now, in general, when it comes to spontaneous thoughts, one of the categories of spontaneous thoughts is called depressive rumination. And it's identified as one particular way in which we absorb ourselves in repetitive, depressive thoughts that especially follow a certain trauma. Right? Now, one can ask, of course, what exactly is the relation between these, repetitive, depressive ruminations and daydreaming? right? Could we not conceive of them as a particular kind of daydreaming? I would say that some of them can certainly be kind of daydreams, but not necessarily all of them. Some of them might also be kind of mind wanderings, where we would be dealing with underdeveloped stories, right? So in psychology, yes, indeed, we come across quite a few studies of this phenomenon. From a more philosophical standpoint, one can also ask the question, what is the function of these depressive ruminations, right? And then indeed, one would have a good basis to speak of these ruminations as a certain basic mode of thinking, as a basic mode of the cogito. In other words, one could argue that these depressive ruminations are ways of working out, are ways of working with the trauma, are ways of trying to find an answer, a solution, and distance from the trauma, a way of rethink what the trauma itself is. So that would be one possible approach to take. Let me add one more brief note in answering your question. There is also further very interesting research done on this, research that some might find quite surprising, quite unexpected. And this is the kind of research that you come, especially among cultural anthropologists. There is research on different spaces and how different spaces are shaped so as to invite different kind of thoughts. Say, it turns out here, it so happens, I'm now in a quarantine hotel on my 5th day delivering this lecture. Now, it turns out that hotels, the spaces in hotels that I cannot access because I cannot leave my room, but spaces in hotels are structured in such a way that they would enable us to engage in different kinds of daydreams, right? So say when you enter a lounge, what will be the music that will play? How will the environment look around you? What should a restaurant or a bar look like, and so on and so forth, right? So in other words, our daydreams are shaped not only by our past experience, which is certainly very visible in the case of trauma, but they are also shaped by our surroundings. There is also further interesting work done, not only on space, but also on time. How different kinds of daydreams come to us at different moments of the day. How relaxing daydreams come in the evening, how disturbing daydreams come at what is called the hour of the wolf. I believe that's Fitzgerald's expression. That is around 3 o'clock in the morning, and so on and so forth. So there is quite a bit of interesting research done on this, not only by linking daydreams to our past experience, but also linking it to, to the spatio-temporal framework of our existence. And maybe that also speaks to the question of the life world that was raised earlier. The role that how is it that daydreams themselves unfold in the life world? Another very interesting question. Thank you.
Oh, I saw a question pop across somebody's face. Well, I'm going to jump in. I have a question. So this is a constitutive function, not of experience, you say, but of thinking. So I wonder if daydreaming is a certain mark of man, of some sort of essence within our animalia as a spiritual being. So this is a mark of humanity, our ability to daydream.
Yes, this is very much something that interests me, namely, you could say the constitutive or the genetic function of the distance that comes along with daydreaming. Right? Daydreaming introduces the distance in our experience from things unfolding around us. Right? But this distance is of such a nature that we don't abandon ourselves from the world that we find ourselves in. We're still there, although at a distance from ourselves, at a distance from the world. So this distance becomes a relation to the world itself. Now, this distance itself is, of course, something that is fundamental when it comes to thinking. Without distance, you cannot think. Right? the same way with any kind of even, perceptual phenomena. If an object is too close to me, if the cell phone is too close to me, I cannot see it. I need distance from it in order to see it. So also with thinking, I need distance in order to think, right? So this spark to which you are alluding to, one could say the working hypothesis would be, might we not think of the distance that daydreaming introduces as this very spark that ignites the cogito itself? That very spark that we need in order to think. Then daydreaming would be a very basic modality of thinking that need not be articulated in language, a mode of thinking that we quite likely share with many other animals who are also capable of daydreaming, right? This very basic phenomenon that allows for further development.
Well, thank you.
Professor, you mentioned there was a term that appeared in your paper. It's this word freedom. And I'm thinking back to a class that you taught on the phenomenology of imagination. And that was such a central term in that class. We were reading The Imagination by Sartre. I'm just wondering what role does that word? It's a word that's mentioned towards the end of your paper, I think in the conclusion. But I guess in general, what role does the phenomenology of imagination play in daydream? I kept trying to find parallels here. Is there some way that we can? There's some specific concepts there that makes sense.
Great question, Eric. Thanks for raising it. It's always such a great pleasure when your former student more than 10 years later remembers the content of the lectures. Quite remarkable. So indeed, you are right to note it's also a very perceptive question that this approach that I took to daydreams towards the end of the paper was, you could say, Sartrean at heart because of the emphasis that I lay on freedom. Right? So this distance from the actual world that comes with daydreaming, I interpreted it as the foundation of that freedom that we have, that we need in order to think. Right? So now, how does it all link up to the imaginary? How does it all link up to imagination? Two things I would like to stress. So first of all, when I'm trying to think here, I'm trying to suggest that daydreams are, if you will, absorbed fantasies. I'm trying to think of daydreams as displaced fantasies. Another way to put it, other terms to use would be to say, well, if what for the most part in the philological literature, what is addressed are conscious fantasies, that what I'm interested in here are unconscious fantasies. To go back to Sartre, you could say, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to introduce new members into the family of fantasy and imagination. Remember, he speaks of the image family, right? So what I'm trying to say is that the fantasies that we entertain can be lived through not only from the here and now, but they can also be lived through from a displaced standpoint. And daydreams are of such a nature. So that's the first thing that I would emphasize. And here, again, I'm alluding to a rather specific conception of daydreams because daydreams can be understood, as I mentioned, both in a broader and in a narrower sense. So in a broader sense, I can be absorbed in fantasies, just as I can be absorbed in memories, just as I can be absorbed in anticipations, right? And you can say, well, in all cases, we're dealing with daydreams. So that's the broad sense. Right? In a more narrow sense, one can say, well, let's draw further distinctions. We have daydreams, and daydreams are absorptions in fantasies. And alongside daydreams, we also have absorptions in memories and absorptions in anticipations. Right? So here, this distinction is also of significance in the context of the question that you are raising. So such would be my answer to this question.
We have another question in the Q&A. Is an artist, for example, a surrealist daydreaming? Here he paints in a mental state close to trance level, unaware of their immediate surroundings.
Also a very interesting question. You know, here, when it comes to art, and when it comes to the aesthetic or artistic import of daydreams, if we ask, why are daydreams of importance in the framework of art? There's quite a bit that one can say here. One, you know, if one were to begin with examples, then one way to proceed would be to work out, you know, an answer by building on the basis of Bronte sisters. Bronte sisters received a gift of 12 toy soldiers and entered into a game of sorts as children. And they were developing various stories among themselves that were games. Right? And in many years, these daydreams were developed into novels. Right? So the same concerns not only the Bronte sisters, of course, but also you know, other artists as well. Orhan Pamuk, if I'm not mistaken, once complained about the significance, not the significance, but the effects of television in Istanbul in the 1970s. He said earlier, what we used to do in entertainment is look through the window and engage in daydreams, and now, you know, we're engaged in what it is that the television feeds us, he was saying, right? And presumably for Pamuk, these daydreams that one lives through by looking through the window are later developed in novels. So I would follow the same structure when it comes to surrealism or any other form of art for that matter. I would say that daydreams are not just those kind of experiences which we could label under the heading of escapism. I would say that daydreams can be highly fruitful in various frameworks of life, and especially when it comes to art. Quite likely the, you know, creative moment in art heavily relies on the daydreams that one lives through. Quite likely this creative process, when one turns already, you know, to this material, because all art is a matter of working with material, and that's where the distinction from mere daydreams is to be found. So quite likely when it comes to this shaping the material that we come across in art is a matter of a further development of those kind of daydreams that we live through in the absence of this material.
Could I ask another question? So I had a question. So I guess one fundamental part is that of daydreaming is like there's two worlds. There's the fantasizing world and there's the actual world. And there's like a Ich-Spaltung between these two worlds. So I think you also wrote about like horizons in other books and stuff. But how do you think these two worlds are interacting with each other? So is it like a melting together, or is it overlapping, or is it like a some type, like how would you explain the interaction of these two horizons?
Yeah, this is a very complicated question.
Yeah,
a very complicated question. In fact, Eric referred to a class that I delivered still when I was in the United States before I moved to the Far East. So a dozen of years ago or so. And this question that you raised was one of the most fundamental questions in that class. And we were trying to look at the interrelation of the fantasy world and the actual life world in which we find ourselves. And there were three different fundamental approaches, you could say, that we looked at. So first, radical separation. And that's what you come across in Husserl, where one primarily focuses on free fantasy, pure fantasy. And the purity of the fantasy, why it's not just fantasy, but pure fantasy, is because this fantasy is purified of anything that is actual. Right? That's what pure means. Besides this radical separation, we also looked at Merleau-Ponty. And in Merleau-Ponty, you could say fantasy is that invisible without which the visible is not possible. Fantasy is that absence which fills the gaps in presence. Fantasy infiltrates our life worlds in the most direct way by shaping the worlds in which we live. And then there is a third possibility also to consider, and that's what we also did in that course a dozen of years ago, and that's a possibility that you find articulated in the works of Paul Ricard. And here also the idea is that fantasy can be productive. Fantasy can shape the world that we live in, which it does. But what Ricard especially emphasizes is a certain dialectical nature of the process in which fantasy does that. So Ricard, is the thinker that he is, he wants to argue that indeed fantasy as such is cut off from the actual world, and it needs to be cut off from it. But precisely because it is cut off, it can return back to the world and reshape it. So fantasy both needs the distance, of which Husserl spoke, but we cannot just stop at the distance. We need the return movement, and fantasy becomes productive when it returns. So there are at least three different, you see, ways in which one can then speak of this interrelation of fantasy and actuality. And in this particular case, we can say the same thing about daydreams here. Daydreams can perform just an escapist function, but daydreams also can shape and reshape the actual worlds in which we live.
Yeah. Any more questions in the Q&A? Attendees.
I did have one question. I was attempting a brief survey of this area of phenomenology earlier today. I think one thing that your paper does really well is differentiate all these terms in the beginning, the night dreaming and daydreaming and the modes of attentiveness. Something that I came across was one of the quotes from Bachelard. It was about daydreaming requiring poetic circumstances to unfold. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is just the poetic or poesis. Like it's something of a mood, it's something of a state of mind in which things become, it creates that displacement or that distance that you were mentioning. But all these things we're trying to define daydreaming in some sense, because we're trying to differentiate it from some mode of our everydayness, of our everyday kind of mindset. Is there something specific about the way you're trying to address this in your paper for the kind of mood you have to be in, or the type of like separation you have from your daily concerns? Now you're differentiating this from night dreaming and from daydreaming. I'm trying to sum up my question here. I guess it's about the mood or the poetic nature of daydreaming.
Yes. I see them as two important but somewhat separate questions. So Bachelard is quite fascinating in this regard indeed, when we look at what exactly he does in his Poetics of Reverie. Because it is a work that is, it's a work that is phenomenological at its core in a very specific way, because Bachelard is a very specific kind of phenomenologist. What he's trying to do there is, okay, so our theme is daydreams. And now he, along with a few other thinkers, he doesn't think of daydreams in a way that is just, for him, daydreams is not just a matter of our own spontaneous formations. But Bachelard, daydreams link us to the elements. That is one of the insights that he wants to articulate in this book. So daydreams for him have also this disclosive function. Just as perceptions disclose something, just as memories, just as anticipations, so also daydreams. But Now, how are we to proceed phenomenologically if we want to articulate such a strong claim, to say the least, right? Can such a strong claim, be not just speculative, but can we find phenomenological evidence for it? And here is Saulius Genius. He says, what I will do is not look at daydreams as such, because in a way, for various reasons, we can speak about that, it's difficult to access them. What I'll try to do is look at literature on daydreams, because literature on daydreams, anybody can access, right? It's in this regard, it is the poetics of reverie. I'm looking at the poetics, at what the poets have to say, right? And I will show and demonstrate, so he wants to argue, that when we look at what the poets have to say, we'll see that, that they speak of how daydreams link us to the elemental. And they link us then to the elemental through various kinds of atmospheres, which is a concept that then becomes of great importance for him. So daydreams have their own atmospheres, say in some of his works, Bashara speaks of different atmospheres that our home has, that the steps leading to our basement have, that the steps leading to our attic have, and so on and so forth. And this is linked to the whole problematic of the elemental form. But there is no question, even if we don't commit ourselves to Bachelara's framework, there is no question that daydreams have their own atmosphere. Yes, right? And again, as I mentioned earlier, that this is something that is known even, say, by the hotel industry, that creates different atmospheres and different spaces so that you are, so that you lose yourself, in particular daydreams, and one in one way or another even wants to exploit this, right? So this is something that is by no means unexpected news, right? So here I would say we find ourselves in a kind of a hermeneutical circle. On the one hand, daydreams themselves create atmospheres. On the other hand, atmospheres themselves shape or motivate us to fall into specific daydreams that we fall into.
This is very interesting, and there's a work on space, I think, that he has as well, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. So these references to how our home is structured in terms of different spaces. That's why he speaks of different atmospheres. Another more contemporary thinker, Herman Schmidt, has a lot to say about atmospheres. Most of his works are in German. He represents what he calls Neue Phenomenologie, the new phenomenology. And there are a number of volumes that he has published. Some of his works, especially on atmosphere, shorter works, are also translated into English. So I don't know if you read German or not, but also in English, you can access some of his works. If the concept of phenomenology of atmosphere is of interest. He's one of those thinkers that focuses on that in more recent years. He has passed away recently.
All right. Are there more questions? Okay. Any final concluding thoughts from you, Saul?
Well, I've been speaking for an hour and 20 minutes. So when it comes to concluding thoughts, let me just say that, a few things. So first, thank you again for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share with all of you my thoughts. That would be first comment. Second, less formal comment would be, for me, it's a great pleasure to see those faces of people whom I haven't seen in so many years. So talking of atmospheres, it's a pleasure to once again fall into the atmosphere that I have lived in more than a decade ago. I hope you had a similar experience. I hope it was a shared atmosphere, not just a solipsistic, narcissistic one. So really wonderful to see you all. Please stay in touch. I haven't heard from many of you in too long, and it's always a pleasure to hear from you. So I'm so glad to see that after so many years, you are still engaged in these philosophical thoughts and phenomenological thoughts. I hope to see you continue doing that.
Thank you so much, Saul, and thank you everyone for joining us on screen and to our attendees in the chat. This was great, wonderful questions, wonderful dialogue, and I'm very grateful. I indeed fell back into that space, scribbling furiously, so many notes. So that was great. Yeah. All right. Well,
wonderful.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and stop recording.
Okay, and I want to thank everyone for the questions as well. They were very good questions and thoughtful questions that directly pertain to the paper that I was presenting.